Okay, hello everyone. It is now 3 p.m. Eastern time, so I think we'll get started as our time together is relatively brief. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and thanks to the RSA Careers Committee, especially our chair, Debbie Haughey, and to Eric Detweiler for providing the logistical support and the technical expertise to make this run. I'll be chairing the event today. My name is Robert Topinka. I'm a senior lecturer at Birkbeck, University of London. And I'd also like to thank all of our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a minute. So what our panelists will be speaking to today is about how rhetoric looks from their location in the world. So they'll be looking at both the job market and at disciplinary approaches. The comments will be brief, hopefully around 5 minutes, and that will give us plenty of time for discussion afterward. You can submit your questions using the question and answer function, and then I'll moderate a discussion for our panelists, and hopefully we can get into some interesting themes and ideas. So without further ado, as I said already, our time is short. I will introduce the panelists in the order that they will be speaking. So our first speaker will be Tyler Carter. Tyler is an assistant professor of rhetoric and writing at the Language and Culture Center at Duke Kunshan University in Kunshan, China. So he currently works with both graduate and undergraduate programs at DKU, and he teaches courses in rhetoric, academic writing, and oral communication. His research focuses on comparative rhetoric, composition pedagogy, and L2 writing. His PhD is from Purdue University, which he received in 2017 in rhetoric and composition and second language studies. And he also earned an MFA in poetry from Brown University in 2005. And he's also taught academic and argumentative writing, ESL, and poetry at Purdue, Academy of Art University, and Brown. Following Tyler will be Catalina Uribe Rincón, and she is an assistant professor at the Center for Journalism Studies at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. She received her PhD in communication studies in rhetoric and public culture, which I didn't mention is also where I got my PhD, and now I'm in London. So you see the Chicago to London trajectory is what sparks my interest in this event. And for Catalina, it's the Chicago to Columbia trajectory. So her PhD is from the Rhetoric and Public Culture program at Northwestern University. And her research focuses on political communication, visual rhetoric, and journalism studies. And she has a special interest in the power of media and the construction of public characters through media narratives. And she's published articles on presidential rhetoric and public opinion in Latin America and on government communication and media coverage during war times, especially during the Colombian armed conflict. And she's also been a weekly columnist for El Espectador since 2013. And then following Catalina will be Jennifer Nish. Jennifer is an assistant professor of technical communication and rhetoric at Texas Tech University. And before that, she was an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition at the American University of Beirut. Jennifer's research interests include transnational feminist theory, digital media, activist rhetoric, genre studies, and disability studies. And her book, Activist Literacies, Transnational Feminisms, and Social Media Rhetorics, will be published by the University of South Carolina Press this November. She has experience with research, teaching, and writing program administration in the US and in Lebanon, and has international job search experience as both a candidate and search committee member. And last but certainly not least will be Lisa Villadsen. Lisa holds a PhD in communication studies from Northwestern University and is professor of rhetoric and head of the section of rhetoric at the Department of Communication at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Her research interests revolve around contemporary political rhetoric, particularly issues of populism, rhetorical citizenship, and official apologies. Lisa is the co-editor of Populist Rhetorics, Case Studies, and a Minimalist Definition from Palgrave Macmillan in 2022, The Rhetoric of Official Apologies, Critical Essays from Lexington Books in 2021, Rhetorical Citizenship and Public Deliberation from Penn State University Press in 2012, and Contemporary Rhetorical Citizenship, Purposes, Practices, and Perspectives from Leiden University Press. So that's our lineup of excellent panelists. I'm very excited to hear from all of them. So I will now turn it over to Tyler, who will get us going.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you, RSA. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to spend 5 minutes talking about, they gave us some questions, and so I'm going to kind of speak to the questions beforehand. The first question is about the application interview process of where I'm based. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, where I'm based, and then the whole application process. So DKU, or Duke Kunshan University, is a Sino-US joint venture. We're a partnership between Duke University in the United States and Wuhan University in China. I think the closest equivalent university is NYU Shanghai, that many folks have heard of. It's a little bit older than us, so that's why folks have heard of it. Kunshan, the city in China where we're located, is next to Shanghai. It's about a 19-minute fast train to Shanghai. And the university itself has three big pieces. One is the UG program, one is a grad program, and one is the Language and Culture Center where I work, or AKA the LCC, as we call it. In terms of application and interviewing, Duke Kunshan is essentially an American university, and the hiring process is very similar. So there's 2 rounds of interviews, there's a campus visit, and more or less people's materials would be the same as if you were applying to an American university. That is at least within the Language and Culture Center. For the UG program, it's a little bit different of a hiring process because they hire in large batches, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So there's a lot of sort of group hiring. And we're fairly open to spousal hires as well. I'm about to start my 6th year, though this year I'm on a pre-tenure sabbatical, so I'm actually in the States right now, and I won't be back to DKU for another year. So moving on to the next question, how potential applicants frame themselves for the disciplinary context of China. I can't speak to the sort of big picture there, but I can certainly speak to my own experience, which is in the Language and Culture Center. They have been looking for folks with backgrounds in writing or Chinese language. And then there's a bunch of adjacent disciplines: intercultural communication, global and comparative rhetorics, which is where I come from, education, and language-related fields such as TESOL and applied linguistics. All to say that when I applied, I didn't really emphasize my rhetoric background. I more or less emphasized my second language studies background. So in addition to getting a PhD in rhetoric and composition at Purdue, I also studied second language studies, working with Tony Silva and other folks on L2 writing. So more or less when I applied, I emphasized that, because the short version of all this is that rhetoric isn't really a discipline in China. It's not recognizable. The Chinese translation of rhetoric literally is something like is style, or using fancy words. So, and finally, the last question here, what should applicants understand about the broader structure of higher education where I'm based? And specific to that, I think there's 2 categories. One is the opportunities and one is the challenges. But the biggest thing to understand about Duke Kunshan or many other Sino joint ventures in China or elsewhere is that they're startup universities, so they're being built. So at DKU, we're building systems, including building curriculum, building a writing center, building faculty governance. And that was something I was chair of the faculty governance, not currently, but I was a couple years ago in the earlier incarnations. And then when I come back from my sabbatical, I'll also be building, helping others build a writing program. So this is one of the things about new universities. There's a lot of opportunities. It's kind of a radical difference than universities in the States. So speaking of that, in terms of funding and expansion, so we are just growing in huge amounts. So when I came in 2017, there was 5 people in the LCC. Now there's about 42. Our UG program had 0 faculty, and now we have about 160. We have been hiring about 45 people each year. Most of those jobs are tenure track jobs, but this year is actually going to be the last year that we're doing a big hiring push, because after this year, then we'll have sort of all the faculty we need to run the university from here on out. So another characteristic is there's a lot of funding, there's a lot of support for research. Our students are great, and the faculty are very much international, and so that's one thing I should note as well. Our students are about 60% Chinese, but 40% international. So, and then finally, the last thing to talk about in terms of the institutional context is the challenges. So China is a big place. It's a big government in China as well. The Chinese language is difficult. There's all those kinds of things. But I think the thing that people probably think most about within the China context is academic freedom issues. And certainly that is a concern for all of us faculty and students, and especially Duke University. But I haven't personally experienced any issues with that, but I'd be happy to talk more about it. And then the last thing to say that COVID, as it's affected everyone, has been incredibly disruptive at DKU, especially since our international students have not been able to get back into China since they left during 2020. And same thing with some of our faculty. So we've been hybrid and beyond for a long time now. But I think so I'll leave it there, and I'll let the other panelists speak. So thank you.
Great, fantastic, Tyler. Thanks so much for getting us going. And we'll move along to our next panelist, who is Jennifer Nish. Jennifer, take it away.
Thanks. As my bio sort of said, I previously worked as an assistant professor in the English department at the American University of Beirut, and I'm going to talk especially about that experience, but I've also transitioned from that position back to a position in the US. So I'd be happy to talk about my experience with that transition as well. So I got my PhD in 2014, and my first job that I got that started in 2014 was as an assistant professor at the American University of Beirut. I'm going to start saying AUB for short. And I worked there for 4 years. And during that time, I also served on several search committees, 2 for rhetoric positions and 1 for women's and gender studies position. And in all of those search cases, the application and interview process was very similar to the process at many US universities. So the jobs were advertised in similar places, like professional listservs and things like that. Required documents were similar: CV, cover letter, writing sample, recommendation letters. And then they did initial interviews either at a disciplinary conference, which was 4Cs in my case, or via Skype. Now they would probably use Zoom. And then they did a campus visit as well. So AUB is a private university that bases its practices on the US style liberal arts model of higher education. And that's part of the reason that those hiring practices are so similar. So the American in the name refers to that American style model of education, and not affiliation with the US government or with any other schools with American University in the title, which are 2 common misconceptions that I encountered a lot when I would tell people I worked there. The university was originally founded by Protestant missionaries in the 1800s, but it became a secular school in 1920. And as far as I understand, the reason that AUB hired professors in rhetoric and composition actually had to do with the accreditation process. So AUB is accredited through the US at the institutional level through the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. And so as part of the process for gaining that institutional accreditation, the reviewers recommended that they create a writing center. And so the first AUB professor with expertise in rhetoric and composition was hired in 2004 for that purpose. And 10 years later, when I was hired, we had about 4 faculty lines in rhetoric and composition, and 3 programs to run, which were the Writing Center, the Undergraduate Writing Program, and the Writing Across the Curriculum program. In terms of the broader context of higher education in Lebanon, AUB is one of several Lebanese universities that also base their curriculum and practices on the US liberal arts model. The medium of instruction at AUB is English, except for classes in like the Arabic language and literature program. And there are specific policies in place at the university regarding students' English proficiency and the use of English at the university. There are other Lebanese universities based on other languages and systems, such as Saint Joseph, which is a French university, the public university, Lebanese university. I believe instruction there is typically in Arabic. And these different models are also available in private secondary schools in Lebanon, where students can do different kinds of baccalaureates. And most students receive education in multiple languages, but they can choose a particular, like the International Baccalaureate, the French Baccalaureate, or even the American high school diploma as their secondary school model. And so as a result of that diversity of secondary education, the students we have at AUB had a wide variety of educational backgrounds, either based on their schooling in Lebanon or based on factors like migration. So students who would have maybe gotten their high school education in the US, but went to Lebanon for college. And there were also specific scholarship programs often targeting students from specific areas. So when I was there was a scholarship program for students from Yemen, and another program that was specifically targeting students in sub-Saharan Africa. So there were some specific international student populations. Outside of those, most of the students at AUB are Lebanese. For folks who are thinking about applying to jobs at institutions like AUB, the major thing that I have to recommend is doing your research on the location and the university and articulating your fit for that particular place or location. So the university kind of invests a lot in bringing somebody, overseas, paying for things like moving expenses and stuff like that. But there's a lot of turnover. And so one of the things that we were often looking for in searches was some kind of interest in someone doing their work in Beirut or in Lebanon or at AUB specifically. And it didn't have to be that the research was already about Lebanon, just kind of an articulation of the fit between their research interests and their move to that place. I'm going to stop it there because I think I'm at my 5 minutes, but I'd be happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's really interesting. Yeah, definitely lots of things to follow up on. But let's move along to our next speaker, who is Catalina. Go ahead, Catalina, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Rob, for the invitation, and thanks for everyone who's here on a Friday afternoon. I wanted to start with an anecdote. When I went to the United States for pursuing my PhD, I encountered one particular difficulty when sending my research papers to big conferences. I imagine this is something many of us have had to experience, but I was particularly stressed as I thought I was a poor eclectic rhetorician. I sent papers to the political communication division, but I was very quantitative, then to the international communication division, but it was very focused on global studies, to the rhetorical and communication theory division, but because it was so oriented to American studies, I ended up in the panel of international papers, because believe it or not, despite many academic efforts that have been done lately, I believe 10 years ago, there was this huge volume on rhetoric in South America, but there's still this strange misconception that there is a division between a specific Western rhetorical tradition and the rest. But I wanted to share with you this anecdote because unknowingly that situation prepared me to always think the field of rhetoric in all these possibilities and within its similar fields. And this is very helpful for thinking rhetoric in South America or rhetoric in Colombia. This might sound as a commonplace, but it was the first thing that came into my mind when Rob asked the question about how potential applicants should frame themselves for the disciplinary context. The discipline of rhetoric in Colombia has had a similar theoretical move from ancient rhetoric, rhetorical figures, towards something more in critical theory, power. However, my sense is that the field is still grounded in argumentation and linguistics departments. And well, despite fierce Plato's interpreters, also, there are lots of philosophy departments who do conferences in rhetoric. Nevertheless, I feel rhetoricians have a very good reputation in disciplines in general that include discourse analysis. My research, for example, is framed within journalism studies. I teach rhetorical criticism with an emphasis on media. And I will say that in rhetoricians in South America in general, depending on the research, have a very good chance looking at com studies departments, a lot do political communication, law schools, linguistics, and there's a recent emergence like in the gender studies departments. I've seen lots of colleagues there. So I would say that the place where I have found less rhetoricians compared to the US would be in literature departments, which are like equivalent to the English departments. We don't call them Spanish departments, we call them like literature because they do more like comparative literature. So there is something there, but I would say like in the other fields, it is stronger. Of course, this varies from country to country. I'm aware that Argentina, Mexico, Brazil have been building a strong independent field of rhetoric, also grounded in law and linguistics departments, but they have created, for example, programs like the Maestría en Retórica y Argumentación, the master's degree in rhetoric and argumentation. This is in the Universidad Nacional de Tucumán. And in 2014, the Organización Iberoamericana de Retórica, which is like the Ibero-American Organization of Rhetoric, was created. And it includes different rhetoric societies across Iberoamerica, Cuba, Bolivia, Portugal, Spain. It has opened the possibilities of different rhetoric programs in there. So in some, I feel that rhetoricians, unlike many other fields, have two advantages in South America. The fact that the discipline feels new and continues to build itself. There is a lot to create. And the capacity to adapt the research within different fields. And I say unlike other fields, and here I move to Rob's first and third questions, because in many countries in South America, you graduate from carreras, licenciaturas, or professions. So it's not like the bachelor's degree that is like a little bit broader. This tends to be like more nuanced and in a specific. You graduate as a lawyer. As soon as you graduate high school. You graduate as a linguistics as soon as you graduate high school. So this gives the opportunity to have scholars doing rhetoric-related research in many undergraduate programs that you would never imagine. Sometimes this moves as a postgraduate field, but in here there is a lot to do in undergraduate. It also has a characteristic that I found very different from the US. Bachelors allow students to move more freely while designing their career. And because these licenciaturas are limited, the relationship with student and professor is also a bit different. Students are more oriented on professors telling them a little bit more what to do, but this is a very like social characteristic that I've encountered. They're expecting you to give a prompt guide, respond to specific questions. Classes tend to have a great portion of lecture, but this is more like referring to a sort of way of teaching. In Colombia, application processes are very similar to the US. They have become similar. It's always better if you know someone within the department that could guide you. There is, hold on, that I time myself. So I'm finishing. There is always like you have to, there is a job call, you submit your CV, publications, writing sample. For many job offers, even tenure track, the PhD is not a requirement because, for example, in the department that I teach, there is an undergraduate program in digital storytelling. So if you have something that has to do with rhetoric, digital humanities, or something like that, they would ask you, that is like more not as academic or as theoretical. You wouldn't require a master's degree. Recommendation letter are usually required, but I feel that the hiring process, the most important is like the interview and the job talk. There's a lot of weight on that. How you relate to students in that job talk is essential. How you speak in public. So I believe this is something that rhetoricians do very well. I think there's also a lot of money at the beginning at some private universities. So you can get like some money to start your research, at least for the first year. So I think I'd stop there and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Catalina. That's great. Lots of things to follow up on, as with all the talks so far in the Q&A, which I think we'll have some time for. But let's move along to our final presenter, who is Lisa. Lisa, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me, and hello everybody. It's very nice to be with you. You'll see the light decrease because it's 9 o'clock in the evening here, and although we're in Scandinavia, it does get a little bit darker at night. Like two other people here, I have my degree from Northwestern University. I got my master's and my PhD there after having studied in Denmark, which is my home country. So I know a little bit about what it's like to be in an academic environment that does things differently. And I think that's really the one thing that I would talk about is, you know, just be prepared that people will do things very differently and they think it's okay. It seems to work for them. If you've just been in one system, that can come as a bit of a surprise. But let me speak to the three questions that we got. The first one had to do with the application and interview process. I think it looks a lot like in the States. It's online. You will be probably asked your date of birth and your gender. And if I think you can actually opt out of answering those if you prefer not to. The emphasis will be on research and teaching experience. You'll be asked to provide a teaching portfolio. But it is also a good idea to talk about grant application, dissemination, and organizational service, as well as academic leadership in your application. I would say that letters of recommendation are given relatively little emphasis. And I think I speak from some experience. I served as the head of education for the entire department at the University of Copenhagen, the Department of Communication, for 3 years. So I sat on a lot of hiring committees there across several different disciplines. And since then, I have been involved in hiring several people in the section of rhetoric. So I would say letters of recommendation is not given much emphasis. The process is that there's a hiring committee that shortlists all the applicants and decides who's taken up for consideration. And then there's a different assessment committee that consists of someone representing the section and international experts in the designated field for the job offering. And they will read and write up an assessment of each applicant. And as an applicant, you are then given the opportunity to see this text about you. And if you see any errors or have any comments, you have the opportunity to offer those before that assessment goes back to the hiring committee. Then the hiring committee decides who to invite for an interview. When we're talking about international hires, usually the first interview will be online. And very likely someone will be then invited to an on-campus visit approximately 1 month later. And that will take place over 1 or 2 days. And sometimes there will even be a second online visit. And that's because the jobs that we are now hiring to internationally are so-called tenure track assistant professorships. There are 6 year-long contract. And then when you have done, if you've done well, you'll be promoted to associate. So you really want to make sure that you're hiring the right person. So sometimes 3 interviews are in order. And then once you are offered a job, there's an international mobility office that helps you think about taxes and moving, helping if there's a partner who needs to find a job, looking for daycare options, things like that. There's a setup to help you with practical things. And then in terms of startup, usually it'll say in the job posting when you want someone to start the job, but don't worry about that too much. It's negotiable. Usually it'll be at the beginning of a semester. So if it's, it's only 3 months away, it might be difficult to make the move to Denmark. Then you could negotiate starting 6 months later. That's not something to get too stressed about. But it's a long process. It takes several months. Now, for the second question about framing oneself for the disciplinary context, rhetoric is a recognized and small but well-established discipline in Denmark as it is in the other Scandinavian countries. So if you're a rhetorician, don't be shy about saying it. In fact, in my section, it would really be a strength to say that you're born and raised rhetorician. Because we have a program that specializes in rhetoric, and we're interested in having people who know what we mean when we talk about rhetoric. So rhetoric has about a 50-year history in Denmark and almost as long in the other Scandinavian countries. Just like someone else said, I think it's a very smart piece of advice to think about what it would mean for you to work in a different geographical location. How would that influence your research? How would you maintain some of the networks you already have? What new networks might you want to develop? But mostly, if you study something that's very US-centric, think about if there's a way that might change, or if you might want to change your field, your area of focus altogether to maybe match better the local environment. Pay attention to the wording of the call. Those are always political documents, and there will be some keywords. So you want to stress those. And I'll jump to my third point here. What you should understand about the broader structure of higher education in Denmark. There is the thing that it's public and free, and the students are given a stipend to study. I'm sure there are lots of sociological things to say about that, but that I don't have time for. But that's a fact. It's free education, so in a sense, it is pretty available. Freshmen are typically about 20 to 22 years old when they come into the university, so they're perhaps a little more mature than American freshmen. You should also know that a BA program is only 3 years in Denmark, and a master's is 2 years. And that it has something to do with what's called the Bologna process. That's a long story. I think it also has to do with the fact that Danish high school kind of teaches to a higher level than American high school. So they kind of gain a year there. You should know that BA programs at the University of Copenhagen and in Denmark tend to be relatively clearly disciplinarily oriented. So as an example, my program, they start on the first day studying rhetoric, and they in fact study rhetoric all day for the whole week for 2.5 years. They have different classes, but it's all in one rhetoric program. And then they have 1 semester where they can take electives in other fields or at other universities. So, they're getting a pretty solid, deep specialization in rhetoric. You should also know that in Denmark, it's not a tradition for a job market for people with a bachelor's degree. The government is trying to change that. But as it is, most students will continue on and take a master's degree also. So we don't consider them finished when they have their bachelor's degree. When you work at the University of Copenhagen, your duties will be more or less 50-50 between teaching and research. And then built into that is administration and service. the university has a fantastic ability to frame things as research that, you know, you might think of as just duties, but they say, oh no, it will improve you somehow. I have a few pieces of general advice. I'll just mention two, and then if we have time, maybe I can get out more. In Denmark, as an international applicant, you will be interesting. There's a great interest in opening up the field of rhetoric, diversifying it. The fact that you speak English is not a plus in itself. I'm saying that because I think in some parts of the world, that's actually an added value that you can teach the students English. That's not how we look at it. In Denmark, we're interested in your scholarly, your disciplinary expertise. And when you prepare for an interview, when you write your application, and if you're invited to an interview, you know, think about the place you're looking for as a place to work and a place to live, not as a tourist attraction. So really consider, what would it be like to just be a citizen here, or at least a resident, I should say, not a citizen. And oh, last thing, someone said, get a mentor, you know, find someone who you can ask about all the little things that you're a little shy about, but will really help you understand the system.
Thank you, Lisa. Fantastic. Well, there's so much in those presentations, and I have lots of questions and things I want to say about the UK context, but I'm the chair, so it's not for me to do that. Let's open it up to the field. And we already have a question coming in. So as I said already, please submit your questions via the Q&A function. And we have our first question from David Frank, which is a very good question to start us with. And I'll ask all the panelists to respond if they'd like to, and hopefully they will. And the question is, who are the rhetorical theorists that you turn to in your research and instruction? And maybe one thing to add to this, if I could take the liberty, is have these theorists that you turn to in your research and instruction, have they changed at all as you've moved from, I mean, all of our panelists have, if they're not from the US, have studied in the US. So how have those theorists changed as you've moved to the institutions that you moved to? So I'd like to hear from all the panelists, but would anyone like to kick us off with an answer to that question?
I can start. I would say I sort of draw on a lot of different rhetorical theorists depending on the project I'm working on or the thing that I'm teaching. I think one body of rhetorical theory that goes across research and teaching that I have found helpful in an international context as well is rhetorical genre theory. Folks like Amy Devitt, Mary Jo Reif, Anis Bawarshi, Charles Baserman. One of the things I think that I like about genre theory is that it's very applicable across a range of situations. And I will say that when I started working in Lebanon, because my pedagogical training and my education were so US centric, I had to do a lot of work to try to adapt the theories and the activities that I was drawing on and teaching to students to connect to the local context in Beirut and Lebanon. And sometimes that happened through rhetorical theory, and sometimes it happened through other kinds of texts that we then took a rhetorical lens to analyze.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's great. Any other of the other panelists want to jump in on this one? It's a very interesting question.
I'll jump in very quickly. As someone in comparative rhetoric, like I looked to the people doing that kind of work. So Lu Ming Mao is a big name in comparative rhetoric that I've gone to a lot. But I can't say I teach it when I'm teaching rhetoric, and if I'm working with Chinese students, I'm actually going back to early stuff, not Plato exactly, but more like stuff from the 60s, like the rhetorical situation, like really kind of fundamental stuff that is actually really kind of mind-blowing for some students, especially students who spent, if they went to high school in China, stuff they haven't been exposed to. And the second thing I was going to say is that, to kind of piggyback on what Jennifer was saying, that rhetorical genre theory, though specifically genre theory that is by John Swales and Ken Highland, and those kinds of folks who have a lot more of a language intersection, I think there's a lot more kind of shared middle ground for the folks that I work with that are a lot of linguists. So I tend to turn towards that kind of languagey focused stuff when it comes to rhetoric. Yeah.
Yeah, I will just add in my case, because I teach in like a comm studies and media studies department, depending on the research and depending on the class, if it's like something on rhetorical criticism, it tends to be more like in the Copenhagen's case, very traditional. We go to classical rhetoric and we go back to starting Aristotle. Then if there is a class that I was teaching with a historian, we were doing some memory studies. So we do like contemporary stuff, even US scholars like Sarah van der Hagen. And in my personal research that I've been doing research on the concept of persona, well, we go also to it's very, now that you mentioned that question is interesting because it tends to be very US oriented now that I reflect upon myself. But yeah, it goes back and forth depending on the moment and on the thing we're working on.
Thanks, Lisa. I saw you answered in the Q&A about how you've written that American rhetorical theory forms about half the backbone of courses in your section, Berkshire, Lawnfoss.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to ask, is there another half to that you are combining with? Is there sort of a Scandinavian tradition that you're connecting things?
Yeah, exactly. So so really the other half, there's a little bit of Scandinavian and European, but there is a sense that, you know, we have tried to develop rhetoric research in our native languages. So there's a Scandinavian journal, and we have textbooks written in Danish, and we use those primarily at the BA level. So the students read about half in English and half in Danish, maybe actually more than half in English, just because, well, it's more fun sometimes. But there is a sense that it is important to be able to talk academically in your native language, have a vocabulary to express complicated thoughts in your native language. So that is something that some of us spend time on also doing research in Danish or Swedish or Norwegian.
Thanks, Lisa. Catalina, is that to what extent do you focus your research and writing in English? Do you write in Spanish? Do you write in both? Does it depend on the context?
Yes, well, usually like all the classes I teach are in Spanish, and my research with Latin American colleagues are usually in Spanish. With the network of professors that teach in Latin America, we tend to write in Spanish. I assigned, in my university, for example, you are allowed to assign readings in English, but there is a limit to it. You cannot assign the entire list of readings in English. When recently that I'm working with some colleagues that are around the world where the text has to be written in English. So mostly like the reality is that if you want like to thrive in like the world academia, most of the writing is in English. But in South America, when I write with my colleagues from the universities, I write in Spanish. So it's like depending.
Thanks, that's great. I use British spellings now, and in the UK we use single quotation marks instead of double. It's not quite the same stakes. but it has been an adjustment for me. Okay, so our next question from the audience is, in your present contexts, what attitudes or approaches are most often associated with comparative approaches to rhetorical work? And is this term still in play for you? So would anyone like to take that question on about comparative approaches?
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what that means.
Therese Graban, who asked that, would you like to elaborate on that, or do you? I think the question is about sort of comparative approaches as a sort of specific approach, sort of comparing. Well, I suppose I shouldn't guess. Well, let's give a chance to elaborate, and then we'll. Oh, here we go. Just asking whether comparative rhetorics is understood as a field or subfield in your present context.
So I'll start that one. I mean, if anybody at my university did rhetoric or had studied it, at least in the American context, it might be, but I mean, most people don't know it exists at my university. So that's a very short answer. So that's it. That's all I got. Yeah.
If I understand the question, it might be comparing different national or regional traditions in rhetoric. It's not an area of specialization in any of the universities I know in Scandinavia. I know of a textbook chapter that discusses it to some degree. And then, of course, but in the Scandinavian countries, we delight in talking about, differences across these three countries that seem so similar. So we can always find something that's a little different. So, for instance, during COVID, the strategies from the various health authorities were actually pretty different, and that was interesting to try to understand how countries that seem so similar had such different views of what the right way to talk about COVID was.
Just really briefly, I think comparative rhetorics as a particular approach to rhetorical study is something that would have been understood and valued by my colleagues and I at AUB who were in rhetoric and composition. More broadly, since I think there's also like comparative literature and other disciplines that use comparative in the title, it might be understood through that kind of comparison.
No, I will only add, like when I first read the question and I thought, what would people in Colombia would think when they read comparative rhetorics? I imagine they would think comparative, internationally, like comparing a certain way of doing rhetoric in Colombia and in Germany. And there is like a lot of work that's been done in that way, like comparative international communication, comparative political communication. And in rhetoric, there is a lot of people doing that, but it's like different from what you meant. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Catalina. And I'll mention in the chat function, Eric has dropped a link to what looks to be a really interesting annotated bibliography of global and non-Western rhetorics. And I think from the global and non-Western rhetorics standing group of 4 Cs. So I think that gives a sense of the kind of perspective we're thinking about, which I think maybe some of you are already working with, even if maybe you don't call it comparative rhetorics. I'll have to come back and look at this later. But I also really like the idea of making annotated bibliographies available. That's a great way, I think, to do research. But we have another question from a student, and I think this is a really interesting question. The question reads, I'm a student taking private classes to improve diction and speech structure, which is, of course, one way people often think of rhetoric. And as the student, Alina, is asking, what works would you recommend to read to gain a more holistic perspective of rhetoric? And Alina's also added, I find the discussion super interesting. And if my question is off subject, I apologize. But I don't think it is off subject, because diction and speech is certainly one way rhetoric is understood. And then this question is asking, how do you move beyond that? And maybe the panelists could also link that into their teaching practice, especially as it relates to how students think of rhetoric already. Is this something sorry, there was just a strange noise in my wall, but is this something you're asking them to move beyond in your work, or do the students you're working with and have worked with already have a kind of more holistic or robust understanding of what rhetoric is? I may have made a very clear question complicated. So we could go back to the original question, which is, how would you what kind of sort of introductory works would you recommend to someone trying to get a more holistic perspective, and maybe looping that through the students you teach now, and what you would also say to them where they're coming from would be interesting.
So, I mean, one of the first texts that came to mind for me was actually Swales and Feek's like academic writing for, I think it's called academic writing for graduate students. Although I don't know how much that's like a holistic perspective on rhetoric, but I think that that's a really helpful text in terms of taking a rhetorical approach to analyzing like writing and sort of connecting that to the writing that you're doing. So in terms of like a holistic approach, I often sort of do that kind of pedagogy in sort of a piecemeal way. So I'm not sure that I have like a one text, but I would love to hear other suggestions.
Well, I don't have a text either. I was thinking if this, because I mean, it depends also on the language and everything, but I feel like the what I do in the classes, in my public speaking classes and in speech classes, it's always like encouraged to read a lot of the speeches that you're willing to write, and analyze the structure of each of those speeches, because like even it sounds like a commonplace, when you read a lot of discourses, speeches in the political communication, we read speeches from Colombian presidents, Colombian leaders, and also some leaders around the US, the world, I'm sorry. And I feel that helps to see the different structures and how to improve what you're wanting to write. But yeah, also like Jennifer, I wish if any of other panelists have a suggestion of a text.
Yeah, I put one, my suggestion in writing. I would recommend the book Rhetoric in Civic Life. That's a textbook edited by Catherine Palczewski and two other people, as far as I remember. And that's a general introduction that I think very well frames rhetoric as a force in society, not just a matter of style or persuasion in a narrow sense, but really kind of the oxygen that keeps society going. I think they take a very broad and relevant perspective and shows how we are surrounded by rhetoric in lots of different ways, and indicate critical and interesting ways of studying it. So I think that would be a good place to start.
And so finally, I'll just jump in here. Similar to Jennifer, I sort of put it together piecemeal in terms of teaching rhetoric in the classroom from different articles, but I'm a big fan of the writing about writing approach, though I don't think those articles are always appropriate for students, but I really think that does a really nice job of teaching rhetoric, but at the same time staying focused on languages and structures as well, which I think, at least for the students that I work with, they appreciate that. But I would also say, I think there's actually kind of a divide between kind of pure rhetorical theory stuff and the language stuff. And so I kind of actually, in a course that I teach called Argumentation Across Disciplines, which is looking at how arguments change depending on the discipline you're in, that we spend sort of half the class in a just a full-on rhetorical theory, rhetorical situation, ethos, pathos, logos, that kind of stuff, before switching to rhetorical genre studies and trying to see how those ideas apply in this different system. So that is to say, I think it's hard for there to be a really holistic approach that covers everything. So I think a lot of people probably have to put it together. So that's it.
Great, thanks for those answers. We have 2 questions left, and hopefully we can get to all of them. So I'll try to move us along. So the first question starts with an observation that I'll just note, which is that this anonymous attendee would like the African content to feature in subsequent panels, and I think that's a really good point. There is quite a bit of rhetoric happening as a discipline in South Africa, which is not something we've covered on this panel. So that's a point well taken. And this question is that it seems to this person that faculty jobs in Europe feature more as communication studies, linguistics, political communication, and classical rhetoric. And the question is, are there any reasons for these emphases, and do you see any shifts perhaps happening in the future? And then the next part of that question is, I mean, this is sort of a question about disciplinary traditions. And the next question is, since you've studied rhetoric in the US, how does that shape your response to these disciplinary traditions?
Well, for me, having studied rhetoric in the US has really shaped the way I look at rhetoric. And I was very fortunate to have colleagues when I returned to Denmark and was hired at the university there, who were very interested in listening to what I had to say. So the whole idea of rhetorical criticism was somewhat new. And I was allowed to introduce it. And since then, we have introduced the study of social movements, critical rhetoric, visual rhetoric, rhetoric of science. I would say that there's a very strong influence from the US rhetoric community on Danish rhetoric. And in my teaching, I think my knowledge of American rhetoric has also enabled me to share the love of the spoken word that I think in some ways is more prevalent in an Anglophone world than in my culture, where we tend to be very skeptical and not, say things too grandly. And here you have American rhetors talking with a lot of aplomb. I think that is very helpful for students to understand that people approach oral communication in different ways. The downside of that is that some of sometimes current research, of course, deals with societal issues that are very pressing in a US setting and not as pressing in a Danish setting. So sort of the exigence or the problems that American scholars are dealing with seem somewhat distant for Danish students. And that's one reason why we have to study text from other Scandinavian countries or other European countries that are somewhat more relatable.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm just going to chime in since we have a minute left, just to get the last question in. This previous question also asked about shifts in disciplinary formations. And the last question is, what is your kind of hope and dream for the future of global rhetorics? So if you could work that in as well, a bit of dreaming with your answer, that would be great as we wrap up.
Oops. So I'll just jump in. I guess my hope is that since I'm in China, it'd be great if we could get a Rhetoric Society of Asia. So that would be my hope and my dream. I have done absolutely nothing to make that happen. So we'll see. But yeah.
Just kind of connecting those two questions about studying rhetoric in the US and then hopes for the future of rhetoric. I will say that I think that moving to Lebanon and teaching and doing my research in Beirut emphasized to me how truly US-centric my education and my training was. And so this is a little bit different than what the question is actually asking, but I think that that shift in my own context really caused me to kind of see anew the sort of specific ways that my discipline and my training and my teaching had been very US-centered, and to challenge that and to try to work outside of that. And so I think that my hope for the field, and I think that this is happening, is that there's becoming more awareness of global rhetorics and more conversation across different places and rhetorical traditions. And so I would hope that that conversation and those kinds of connections would continue to grow and expand and to reach people who aren't making those kinds of moves, or who aren't, you know, just interested in transnational rhetoric, but people interested in rhetoric generally.
Thanks for the question. I would say that in the Colombian and more broadly South American case, I think that that movement between having rhetoric in that field that one of the questions mentioned, like linguistics, political communication, persuasion, and on the other side, what is growing that is more the critical theory, the power, the gender studies, disability studies, that is also growing, because we had those undergraduate degrees so separate. All the new rhetoricians want to merge them. So I feel like in that movement, we have created the Colombian Rhetorical Society. So I think not to lose neither the greatness of having it as a small discipline, but also like connected to the critical theory perspective. And also now that we have like the Ibero-American Society, or Sociedad Iberoamericana, that includes Portugal, Spain, and South America, I think that's a great beginning of a big society that includes small country societies. So maybe like try to make all those connections with the Rhetoric Society of America and the future Chinese society, Chinese Rhetoric Society that Tyler is going to be the pioneer.
Great. Lisa, did you want to add something? Yeah.
I'll keep it super brief. I know we're over time. I am very concerned about populism and political rhetoric, and it doesn't matter where you look, it seems to be growing. Populism takes very different forms in different parts of the world. I wish for the not too distant future, because I think we're kind of in a rush here, that we need to talk more about how we, as scholars and teachers, may prepare students and citizens to, you know, be more robust and speak up against populism.
Great. That's a great way to end, with a shared vision and some shared concerns. So I'd just like to thank our panelists again: Tyler Carter, Jennifer Nish, Catalina Uribe Rincón, and Lisa Villadsen. Thanks to Eric Detweiler again for making things go, and thanks to everyone for coming and for listening and for your fantastic questions and discussion. And thanks for hanging with us as we ran a few minutes over. And as Eric has posted in the chat, there will be a recording available at the RSA's YouTube channel in the next few months, along with previous RSA remotes. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. Have a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night, depending on where you are. So thanks again, everyone, and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.